Welcome to episode 29 of 1530. Today we're going to be talking about some throwback matches because tennis is still not happening. We're still on hold due to the COVID-19 pandemic, but we want to talk about some great matches in the past, and we'll still cover stats as we usually do. But first, I'll start us off with a stat of the day as we usually do. So the stat of the day I have for you today is 57 winners. So the two matches I want to be talking about today are two matches that Stan Wawrinka played at the French Open, since normally this is the time where the French Open be happening. It's the first week of June. So I want to talk about Stan Wawrinka, and I'll get into how he played Stefanos Tsitsipas in an amazing match last year that went 5 sets. It was their first career meeting, and it was a firecracker. Stan Wawrinka had 57 winners. He won that match narrowly. He also won his first and only French Open title against Novak Djokovic with also that same magic number of 57 winners. And just thought that was interesting as I was going through there. Stan played some amazing tennis, came up with some huge winners, especially there was one notable behind or around the net post shot with his backhand at full speed that was amazing. The crowd amazed me when I was watching as well. So I'll get into and talking about that match. Because I'm not a huge French Open fan, but I'm actually missing it quite a bit right now. I prefer Wimbledon, but Matt, what do you got for us?
Yeah, so let's start out. Last time we recorded, we talked a little bit about Agassi and Sampras and some of their epic rivalry. We just touched on one match. I wanted to take a more macro view of their rivalry over through the 90s mostly, and look at a little bit kind of how they compared to the big three that we see today. Obviously, I think that you have to include the caveat up front, right? That the game of tennis has changed a little bit since even just in the 21st century, since Agassi and Sampras had their heyday. Nonetheless, it's fun to compare and kind of look at their styles and their games. Agassi, as most people know, was known, I would say, more comparable to Djokovic, maybe a little bit of Nadal, in the way that he was super aggressive on the return, right? He was known as probably one of the best returners in the game, especially while he was at his peak, just as we talk about Djokovic today. Whereas Sampras was more of the Federer-esque type, super aggressive first and even his second serve, and followed up his shots a lot going to the net with that style of game that we see in Federer play, just smooth and calculating, super smart tennis player. So I wanted to look at those. We have these general ideas. Agassi, super good returner, maybe not so much on serve. Sampras, the opposite. And then to see how those numbers, as I said, compared to the big three. What we see is really kind of interesting. So if we look at service points won, the percentage, and then that's obviously feeds into the service games that you win, right? If you win more points on your service, you're going to win more games on your service. Amongst these 5 players, Sampras actually does come in first over his career, over the careers of everybody. Percentage-wise, he won 69.4% of his service points, which led to him winning 88.8% of all of his service games. Whereas Agassi came in dead last. So he was down at 65.8% of his first serve points won and only 84% of his service games won. So he was, almost 5 percentage points below Sampras. If you compare this to the big three, it's interesting to see Fed is almost exactly the same as Sampras. So he wins 69.7% of his service points, which leads him to win 88.8% of his service games, which that game percentage is the exact same as Sampras, and he's 0.3% better in his service points won. So really close there. And then you look at Nadal and Djokovic, and they are also exactly the same. So their service points won were at 67.5%, and Djokovic 67.3%. And then their service games won was 85.8% exactly for both of them. So you see
weird,
this,
yeah,
right? This super interesting dichotomy. Yeah, it's kind of freaky. But so that held up, right, over the careers of these two players. Sampras, clearly a better server winning 5% more of his service games than Agassi won over his career. And so that was just really interesting to see. Ben, you brought up the serve factor a couple recordings ago.
Yep.
You want to talk about that a little bit?
Yeah, so we
put
can
those
talk about
together
that.
here.
Yeah, we basically wanted to use that as a way to analyze the matches of the Australian Open and really for any matches on, but that's when we developed the serve factor here at 1530. So what we talk about for that is really, right, because you have some players like Federer who are really good at winning the first serve point. Sampras, again, is another one of those, right, where, as you said, Matt, they use a really big first serve, they can get to net, or they can hit that really big first forehand and win the point. Other players like maybe Nadal or Sampras, they're better really getting into the rally. Maybe they have better second serve percentage. Maybe they just have a better first serve percentage, getting the ball in. So it's kind of hard. You have so many numbers to look at. We just wanted one number at 1530 to kind of boil everything down to how good are they serving. So we call it the serve factor. So what goes into that is we basically take the first serve percentage as a percent, and we add it, or we multiply it to the first serve points won as a whole number, and then we add it to the second serve points won as a whole number. And then you come up with a number, and it can be over 100. Obviously, if you're serving 100%, first serves in, which is unlikely, but it could happen. And then you're high on both of the other numbers. You could be pretty high. I think the most we saw when we were charting the Australian Open was around 130. But here we have the serve factors for the different players. So as you talked about, Matt, we expect Federer and Sampras to probably have some of the best serve factors. Wasn't necessarily the case. So we'll go through them real quick. So we have Agassi at 98.6. We had Sampras at 100.7. We had Federer at 105.1 about. Nadal at 106.6. And Djokovic at 103.3. So really not a huge spread. The lowest was Agassi at 98, almost 99. Really, that's not a huge spread between 99 and what was that, 107 about. But it was just weird to see Sampras and Federer not lead it. And I was very, thought that they would lead that. Nadal actually had the best serve factor overall, 106.6. And it looked like, just from the number, the big one that stands out is, even though he doesn't win as many points on his first serve percentage is a lot higher over his career. And I'm assuming, Matt, these are career numbers, including the slams, or were they just the slams?
They are, yeah, their career. So every match they played.
Every match they played, which is crazy, like you're saying, when some of these numbers end up being so similar. But yeah, interesting to see that. It's kind of a different era here, that both Djokovic, Federer, and Nadal all over 100 on their serve factor, and it's so close. Their spread is 103 to 106.6. So pretty amazing that all these guys are able to serve at the level they serve in all aspects of the game. They do it a little differently, right? Federer's maybe a little bit more aggressive in the first serve. Nadal's good at getting that first serve in, and second serve he's really good, and Djokovic is solid really on both. But it's just an amazing era of tennis that we live in.
Yeah, and I think an interesting point on the serve factor is, you look at obviously the three data points you put into there. Nadal, who has the highest serve factor here, has the highest first serve percentage, right? He got 68.3% of his serves in. Whereas Sampras, who, I guess you can say he's in fourth here compared to everybody, had the lowest first serve percentage. He was at 59.5%. Now, at the same time, he won 81% of those serves that he got in, those first serves that he got in. Whereas Nadal is sitting at 72% of the first serves he gets in and wins those points. So I thought that was kind of an interesting dichotomy to see. All right, well, does it pay to be super aggressive on that first serve and, maybe miss a couple more times than usual, but get your opponent on their back foot more often? Or is it better to just have a well-placed, confident first serve and then get into the point?
Right. It's always that the trade-off, like you're saying. Do you go for the ace, or if you miss it, you risk a double fault, or even almost worse sometimes is the other player on the other side can tee off on your second serve, which I know Murray, he had good ace count, had good first serve, but his second serve is always pretty weak, relatively. And so some of these players are able to pounce on it. It's like you're saying, it's a hard thing to coach. It's kind of based on your player's strengths, but clearly Nadal has done a great job, even though he doesn't always go for a lot of aces.
True.
Another quick note on the serve factor. So we did, and this wasn't something that when we designed it, we knew, but we just kind of found out from charting matches was we would compare the winning player to the losing player on the serve factors. We would subtract the two, take the delta. And what we saw was that in general, the person who had the better serve factor won, which made sense, but also it kind of matched up to how decisively they won. So a serve factor difference, delta of about 30 was a very decisive straight sets win. A difference of 20 was maybe a tight straight setter or a four setter that was decisive. And then it went on from there all the way down to 5 sets. If it was a difference of 10, it was a decisive 5 setter, meaning, a couple of the sets were maybe blowouts, 6-1, 6-2 is what I'm meaning by that with decisive. But a 5th setter that really could have gone to anybody was with less than 5. So if you compare Federer, Nadal, Djokovic, their serve factors, if you were to compare them head to head, purely based off the stat alone, I know there's a lot of style and stuff that would be different with these. Not only, I guess Nadal would have the best between them, but they're definitely within 5. You take Federer minus Nadal, it's 1.6. So that would tell you, based on our empirical evidence that we've gotten, that would be a toss-up 5 setter. And then even Djokovic between either of them, that's less than 2 or 3 delta. So yeah, I just think that's interesting with the serve factor. That really, it's all about, as people say, as long as you hold serve and you don't get broken, you're probably going to win, with the exception, of course, of tie breaks. So just an interesting matchup between the two of them. So I wonder if that really truly would be the case with Agassi, if he would have the hardest time against the big 3 today. But it's hard to know because they don't exactly play in the same era. Federer played Agassi, but he was kind of not at his peak anymore. So just an interesting thought there.
Yeah, that is interesting. So moving on to the return side of the game, Agassi's preferred side.
Yep.
What we see is kind of a flip of what we saw with the service, to an extent, right? So coming in first, let's see, coming in first was Rafa. Nadal won 42.4% of his return points and subsequently 33.4% of the return games that he's played over his career. Joe comes in again a really close second. He won 42.1%, so just 3.3% fewer points, return points than Nadal, and has won 32.1% of his return games. And then Agassi comes up again in a close third. So he's at 41.7% of return points won, which led to 31.7% of his return games won. So he's right up there with the top. Fed comes in fourth at 39.6% of his return points won, which led to 26.7% of his return points won. And then Sampras last, right? 38% of his return points won and 24% of his return games won. So almost, 7% fewer return games won by Sampras compared to Agassi. So you can see here, compared to Agassi and Sampras, definitely a really nice dichotomy there of Agassi, obviously super good returner, known for that, and it paid off. It's interesting to see if you can get above that. This is obviously a super small sample size, but if you can get above that 40% return points won, it seems to increase your percentage of return games, obviously. But it seems to increase it by like 5% or more.
Yeah, you're right. There's like a tipping point there, right? Because Federer wasn't that far off, right? He was at 39.6, so teetering on 40, even Sampras 38. But like you're saying, that 40 seems to be the magic number because their return games won are just not that good for Fed and Sampras. I wonder if those are a lot of the deuce games that just can't quite get over the hump, which like Djokovic and Nadal and Agassi were able to. I was shocked by a couple of things. Number one, I was expecting Djokovic, honestly, to have the better return points won, but maybe it's just kind of some recency bias because I know early in his career, maybe struggle took a little longer to get up to speed, but obviously lately he's been good. And the other thing that surprised is, like you mentioned, that how high Agassi was. He was right up there with the big dogs. That's not that big of a difference, especially when you're talking about return games won. He was right there next to Djokovic and Nadal. So I wonder in this era, if it would have been a similar way, if he would have given, maybe Fed or other players more problems because of the return game being so solid. But yeah, you're right. Tennis is fun because sometimes because of the contrast of styles. Thinking Federer, Nadal, or Agassi, Sampras, that's pretty interesting.
Yeah. The last thing I have is just a super quick comparison. Agassi, Sampras head to head in the Grand Slams only, and how these those four percentages changed as they were taking it out of over their career and looking just at them just on the big stage. They played I think so 9 matches all together in Grand Slams. Do you know who has in the Grand Slams? Obviously they played more outside of that. You know who has the lead between these two?
Sampras and Agassi for the lead for the most slams between the two.
The lead, yeah, head to head, just tournament wins.
Oh, head to head. I would go Sampras because I think he had more slams. Is that correct?
Yeah, that makes sense.
Okay.
Right.
Yeah.
In their career head to head as well. I mean, even outside of the slams,
okay,
Sampras has the edge. But what we find is that you can just see in these numbers how they have attacked each other. Their numbers go down in every one of these areas: service points won, service games won, return points won, return games won. It goes down everywhere except for a slight bump in the service games that Agassi won. He actually increased 3%. But I think the biggest difference is that in the return games won, well, so I say this and really, so I'm going to say this with the caveat that these numbers are all really close. So I'll read these out. Exactly. But Agassi, so in the return games won, Agassi dropped 18%, whereas Sampras dropped only 10% of the return games won. So obviously Sampras did a better job of holding his serve, and Agassi did a much worse job in these Grand Slam matchups against Sampras than he normally does. Now, that being said, it's very clear that these matches all came down very closely, right? So Agassi won 13.5% of the return games against Sampras in the Grand Slam matches they played. And Sampras won 13.3% of the return games. Jeez. So, I mean, they're exactly the same, right? Almost, practically. And so, which means that the service games they won almost exactly the same, 86.5, 86.7. And so you see these matches on a statistical basis, the games being won, it's a game of inches, right? Right. So in the end, Sampras won 6 Grand Slam matches against Agassi to Agassi's 3. So.
Interesting. Yeah, like you're saying, when not much separates two players in terms of their, not only tennis ability, but just in terms of even statistics, it makes it hard to even get into. It makes me think about the trade-off where, talking to a player like Federer, and not all the players think this way, but some of them do. That he, you talk to him about statistics, and he, not that he ignores them completely, but that's not his focus, right? He, if he wins, it's a good win. Even if he kind of ekes it out. If he has a close loss, even though statistically looks okay, that's not necessarily something he's going to draw positivity from. So I wonder if it's one of those things where it's like, if the stats help you to get to the top, but not necessarily keeping you there. There's other tactics, or just, I don't know, dare to say, luck, or maybe even some, intuition about where to hit the ball. I don't know exactly, but I just wonder how much these players actually look at the stats, and then especially as trying to get those small little edges. Are they saying, oh yeah, with Nadal, I'm going to try to, spin my serve in a little bit more, or, whatever the case may be, to raise their first serve percentage. I don't know. What are your thoughts on that, Matt? With when it's so close at the top, how much attention do you really think they pay to the stats?
Yeah, I have to imagine that it's not a huge focus, just like you said.
Yeah.
Maybe that'll change in the upcoming generations. Maybe these guys are still just kind of old school, but I mean, you said it exactly. It's when you're on the court, do the stats really matter that much? Yeah.
Yeah, I mean, and maybe the coaches feel differently, but yeah, I just wonder with the players. Like, it's at some point they just have to execute too. They could have the right, the right serve, and then they miss the easy, the easy volley. I mean, we do see the pros miss easy shots, occasionally.
Right.
So sometimes it is just execution, but or nerves in Federer's case, like he said.
Yeah.
Sometimes his coach is like, hey, you've had the game to beat Nadal. You have the right tactics. Just think a lot of it's just nerves and a lot of it's execution. And ever since then, that Australian Open 2017, it's been a very different story every time he's played Rafa. The exception at Roland Garros. So tennis is an interesting sport. Yeah, no, that's fascinating. Yeah, thank you for talking about the Agassi Sampras for us. Let's transition over to French Open because would be the French Open going on right now. So I picked 2 matches out from the vault for looking at here. First, we'll talk about Stan Wawrinka. This is his in 2015 French Open final. This is his second Grand Slam final. His first Grand Slam final, he had beaten Nadal in Australia. He also beat Djokovic en route to that, which was amazing. And Nadal happened to be the number 1 player at the time, so he had to beat him in the final. Here at the French Open, Djokovic beats Nadal, so he becomes the favorite. Of course, Nadal wasn't really fully healthy, but Djokovic had lost to Nadal before, or he had ran into Federer. But point is, this is a very good opportunity for him to complete his career slam. And Stan comes out firing. He does not allow Djok to dictate. In fact, Djok was the one that kind of comes out looking a little bit flat, looking a little bit, playing the counterpuncher, waiting for Stan to miss. And Stan just decides to go for the lines. And so I want to pull up those stats for us today and look at that. So first of all, ace count over the match or ace percentage. So Stan, he's really going for it on his first serve as well. He aces 7% versus 4.5% for Djok. And he did double fault a little bit more. He double faulted 2.5% compared to 0 for Djok. So really, I guess you could kind of take away, the ace double fault. They're pretty much equal on that when you take into account Stan's double faults on that day. But then if you look at the serve numbers, so first serve in, they're pretty much the same, 66% to 65% for Stan and Djok respectively. First serve percent, points won, Stan's is much higher at 76% to 63% for Djokovic. And 76%, that's a pretty high number for clay. Those are usually numbers where you see for a fast hard court or grass. So impressive that Stan is able to really dictate. And then on the second serve, points won, Djokovic is a little bit better at 53% to 51% for Stan. And the breakpoint numbers, they each faced a lot of breakpoints. Even though Stan, he drops the first set, he wins the next 2 sets. But even then, so many of the sets, even once he has the lead and you feel he has the momentum, he gets, into a hole on his service game, a low 30 hole, or he gets a break point and he has to save it. But these guys both saved a lot of break points. So Stan saved 8 of 10 break points faced. Djokovic saved 11 of 15. So we can see that's obviously the difference there, right? So Stan was able to save all but 2. Djok saved all but 4. Djok faced more, but those extra 2 breakpoint differential is really the difference maker. I mentioned the 57 winners for Stan, the stat of the day. Djok, on the other hand, only had 28. So huge difference. As I was saying, Stan was the aggressor, and it really paid off. Maybe it was those shorts. I don't know if you remember those really ugly shorts that Stan had, but maybe Djok was intimidated. But
playing tricks on the guys or something.
Yeah, but even though Stan dropped the opening set, which he ends up doing several times. I guess he didn't do it against Nadal in his slam final, but he did it to Djok in the U.S. Open final when he beats Djokovic in 2016. He dropped the first set as well, but still was able to recover quite nicely. And it's just amazing that if I wouldn't have known this match was at Roland Garros, I would have guessed, like I said, it was maybe a Wimbledon match based on that first serve percentage. So really credit to Stan. And, this was a pretty fun match to watch. I remember watching this one. And there were some great rallies, but Stan, the aggressor, definitely paid off. So definitely one for looking at highlights. If you need some Roland Garros this week, I would recommend watching Stan Wawrinka, Novak Djokovic. The final score was 4-6, 6-4, 6-3, 6-4, and it was Wawrinka being victorious, his second Grand Slam. So pretty amazing. The next, any comments on that match, Matt? Do you remember that one?
Just that it was glorious.
Yeah.
Joke wanted that French Open bad, but didn't get it. Statistically nothing. I mean, when Wawrinka decides to start hitting his shots, he'll hit you off the court, and so it's fun to watch it when he gets into that mindset and he gets into a groove and just goes to town.
Right. And he really did that the entire Grand Slam. So I remember watching the semifinals, or maybe it was the quarters. Don't recall. I think it was the semis against Roger Federer, his countryman, who Federer has beaten him, multiple times. He only has a couple losses to Stan, notably on clay though. But I think Federer had just beaten Stan a couple weeks earlier in Rome in a very easy straight set affair. So I, as a Federer fan, I'm a fan of both guys, but I was assuming this would be a pretty easy match for Federer. But it was a straight sets win for Stan, and you usually don't see Federer go down straight sets. Federer didn't play bad actually. It was a tiebreak in the third set, but Stan was just too good. Federer would be aggressive. He was going to net a little bit, and Stan would just hit a ridiculous passing shot, 100 miles an hour. It was amazing to watch. Like you said, watch Stan be locked in, and he defeated Federer and Djokovic en route to a slam. So he's definitely taken the hard route, winning slams. His first slam, like I said, he had to beat Djokovic, and then Nadal, the number one ranked player at the time. This one, he had to face Djokovic, who's the number one ranked player at the time, to actually get it in the final. And then he beat Federer en route, which, Federer's always been, kind of in the top few guys. So pretty awesome. And then I want to talk about one of my favorite matches of the year last year. It was also the French Open. This was Stan Wawrinka and Stefanos Tsitsipas. It was their first meeting together. Of course, some beautiful one-handed backhands and a five-setter to boot. This one went 7-6, 5-7, 6-4, 3-6, 8-6. Because as we know, French Open does not have a tiebreaker in the fifth set still. It's the only set, or the only major that doesn't have that now. All the majors are unique in that sense, which is cool. And Stan Wawrinka came out the victor. So we'll go through the numbers now. First serve percentage was 68% for Tsitsipas and 62% for Wawrinka. First serve points won, both in the 70s. So again, I would, think this is not a clay court match. 71% for Wawrinka, 74% for Tsitsipas. And then the second serve points won was 51% Wawrinka, 47% for Tsitsipas. So about a 4% difference there on the second serve and about a 3% difference on the first serve. So as you can tell, it's super tight, right? Tsitsipas is a little bit more aggressive on the first serve. Second serve, Stan Wawrinka is doing a little bit better. And then break points. One was 5 for 14 for Wawrinka for a 36% conversion rate. Tsitsipas also won 5 break points, but he had 27 chances to break. I thought that was amazing. He only had obviously a 19% conversion rate. So Tsitsipas had almost twice the amount of chances as Stan did to break. They each broke the same amount of times. Of course, there's a tiebreaker in the first, but Tsitsipas just got to convert those. So it was kind of cool to see, kind of the next gen versus the current guard, kind of battling it out. And it was a beautiful match to watch. Amazing points, very long rallies, and of course, some beautiful one-handed backhands. So in the end, it was, as you would be able to guess, the total points won was 50% to 50%. It was only decided by one single point. Tsitsipas unfortunately won one more point than Stan, 195 points to 194 points. But he still came up loser in that match, which occasionally does happen. And another big number that stands out is 16 aces for Stan versus 3 for Tsitsipas. So Wawrinka again, just bringing it with the serve, and only a handful of double faults. But this is another great fun one to watch if you like some epic rallies and Tsitsipas scrambling all over the court to get the ball. But I don't know if you're able to watch this one last year, Matt, or see the highlights. But
yeah, I think I only saw the highlights of it.
Yeah,
but definitely wanted to go back and find if you can.
Yeah, I definitely want to watch some highlights this week, because we know for the fans, right, it's a tough time without sports. So get out there and watch some highlights and enjoy tennis. It'll be really weird. The last comment I want to make about the French Open, it'll be really odd if the French Open does play in October, which is, I think, still the plan, right after the U.S. Open.
I haven't heard anything against it. So
Neither have I. So just really briefly, I want to make a comment on that. So this was many episodes ago. I believe this was last year, maybe somewhere around episode 15. But we talked about Rafael Nadal, and obviously he's won the most French Opens. It's only been a handful of times that he has not won since he's been playing it since 2005. Once was Federer 2009. Once was Wawrinka, we just mentioned, and then Djokovic won it the last year. So he ended up getting that career slam and overcoming that tough defeat to Wawrinka. Other than that, it's been all Nadal. So, but we also kind of charted off on the warm-up matches how Nadal does and what the win percent is going into the French Open, because usually he is lights out on any match on clay. But there's some years where he struggled out the gates, and some of those years he's lost. Some of those years it's been a close match in the final. So I just wonder, on a normal season, I think he can play himself into form if he's not feeling it, or usually just be dominant from Monte Carlo on. But there's not going to be any clay warm-up tournaments this year if the current plan goes off. So I don't know how that's going to affect, Rafa, and if the conditions are a little bit colder, maybe the court's not being as fast. I would assume that would benefit Nadal, but this would be a very interesting, even just for the statistics aspect, if we play a French Open this year in October. So I don't know. Your thoughts are on that. On Matt, I think you'd still probably favor Rafa?
You have to.
Yeah.
French Open, Rafa Nadal, you cannot.
It's almost automatic now, but
it's almost, yeah. I mean, that is an interesting point, right? They make this argument every year. My dad, he had a rough year in the warm-ups a couple years ago. I think he ended up still doing really well in the French. I mean, sure. Do warm-ups seem to help? Yeah, for Rafa in the French. But I don't know. I think he's going to be hungry to get closer to Fed and see a really prime opportunity to do so. If the French is played in October, so I think he'll be pretty motivated.
Yep.
Warm himself up on his own courts.
That's what I was going to say. I'm like, that guy practices harder than, almost anybody we know. So, he could just put some extra time on the clay courts himself. And as long as he's not injured, I think you always got to favor Rafa. So,
and it's not like they're playing matches somewhere else right now on hard or grass. So, I mean, I guess they'll have the hard court major before, but.
Yep, I totally agree. All right. Well, that's all we have here at 1530. As always, visit us at cognitionsphere.com. Our theme music is brought to us by Kevin MacLeod with excerpts from his song Cool Rock. And until next time, we will see you on the court.